the quiet moment just before a tempest. On the morning of October 31st, 2025, Kensington Palace started off like any other autumn day. Over the carefully tended gardens, golden leaves rained down. The security team changed shifts with the precision of a military commander. Inside, the same careful attention to detail that has been displayed for decades was used to make breakfast trays. However, things would take a dramatic turn by 9:47 in the morning. The meticulously crafted image of Britain's future king would be shattered, and an institution that has endured for over 1,000 years would be rocked by just one comment issued through official channels. The words were brief, nearly to the point of being clinical. According to the royal family, HRH the Prince of Wales has decided to temporarily step down from all royal obligations for an indeterminate period. After consulting with top members of the royal household and His Majesty the King, this decision has been made. We will share more information when the time is right. In this time of need, we beg for your privacy. 63 words, read in under a minute. However, those meticulously selected sentences contain the unraveling of centuries of procedure, decades of anticipation, and years of preparation. The statement quickly became the center of attention in news cycles all across the world. Scheduled programming was interrupted by television producers. As they took in the enormity of what they were reading, the radio hosts went silent. A flurry of speculation, anxiety, and an overwhelming need for clarification burst on his social media. Why would the future monarch do such a thing? A guy who has lived his whole life in preparation for the throne decides to abdicate. Someone in the palace's family had to be sick, or there had to be a scandal that they were attempting to hide. We need to go back 6 months to a spring afternoon at Windsor Castle, when Prince William sat in his study and stared at a letter that had come through his personal correspondence rather than official channels. If we want to know what led up to this moment, unremarkable cream-colored stationery without a return address adorned the envelope. Within, a solitary page adorned with meticulous handwriting that he immediately recognized. It originated with Catherine. No great escape or nighttime flight had been made by Catherine, Princess of Wales. They had 3 children together, and she stayed at Adelaide Cottage. The outer world could tell that nothing had altered. On Sundays, they would go to church together. At benefit functions, they grinned. They kept up the impeccable public persona that is expected in a royal household. Something essential had broken down between them, and she wrote this letter to try to put into words what their voices had failed to express. The weight of having one's every move, every clothing choice, and every parenting choice examined by millions of eyes was something she wrote about. She described the kids, including George, who was starting to grasp the gilded cage that was waiting for him, Charlotte, whose inquiries she couldn't answer, and Louis, who was blissfully oblivious to the fact that his life would never be completely his own. Worst of all, she documented her heartbreak at seeing the man she loved, William, erode away under the weight of convention and obligation. As she grieved the loss of a loved one who stood by her side, but seemed to be far, she hinted at the end that she had married a man who brought her laughter. Here I am, standing next to a prince who has completely lost the ability. There is no reason for me to hold you responsible. Everything that this world throws at you, us, and our offspring is to blame. But I can't act like it doesn't bother me anymore. I refuse to be a part of our children's servitude as they grow into the same corrupt people we are. William took 3 gulps of the letter that afternoon. He did not cry. Even in private, his royal training forbids such outward displays of emotion. Yet something changed within him. An unmovable rock in his identity that had been there from the moment he was born. During dinner that night, he had a fresh perspective on his children. George, who was just 12 years old, was already learning to rehearse his expressions so that he could present an artificial image to the outside world. He observed Charlotte, who was intelligent and perceptive, starting to pick up on the tiny differences in treatment she received as a royal. Looking at Louis, who was still a kid at heart, he pondered how much longer that purity of heart would endure. That evening, Prince William finally gave in to his adult self and asked the question that his ancestors had repressed for years. What if an alternate method existed? 3 days subsequent to the arrival of Catherine's letter, King Charles met with his son in the private sitting room at Clarence House. The look in William's eyes was instantly recognizable to the monarch, who had his own winding road to the throne. Charles, caught between responsibility and longing, had wore that identical face many years before. When he watches his own marriage fall apart due to the pressure of expectations, "Your mother is on your mind," Charles murmured softly. William gently nodded and said, "It was not a question." Diana's influence had always been palpable throughout their household. What happened when the institution put image before humanity is forever symbolized by her awful end. However, that wasn't all. Throughout his childhood, William had devoted a great deal of time to learning about his mother's struggles and triumphs. Attempts she made to establish her own genuine space within a role that required total submission. From the inside out, she attempted to make a shift. It broke her, according to William. With great care, Charles placed his teacup on the table. Despite her best efforts, she remained ensnared by the status quo. That is unique. He seemed unusually cautious as he waited, seemingly considering his next words. Obligation meant giving up something important when I was your age. I gave up being happy. Camilla was my sacrifice. I almost self-destroyed. Because I had grown so miserable that I could no longer play my part convincingly, the institution I was attempting to assist nearly rejected me totally. This was the first time Charles had ever felt the consequences of his decisions. As William beheld his father, he saw not the monarch, but rather the man who had endured decades of newspaper shaming, unflattering comparisons to his sainted wife, and, in the end, achieved happiness at tremendous personal and public expense. I questioned William. What are you suggesting? Charles got to his feet and made his way to the window that looked out over the gardens. My point is that we shouldn't hold on to any organization that actively seeks to eliminate its own employees. If you want to do the monarchy a favor, prove to it that it has to change or perish. Coming full circle, he faced his son again. In the long term, it might preserve the institution as a whole, not only your marriage, if you take a temporary step back now. After then, there was a profound quiet. An act of grave treachery, according to every royal tradition, would have been committed had the monarch of England not effectively given his heir permission to leave his place, put family before duty, and essentially desert the royal family. In spite of this, right then and there it felt like they were having their most open and honest discussion to that point. In the weeks that followed, William had a number of discussions that no prior monarch could have imagined. To understand the legal ramifications of temporarily removing himself from the succession line, he conferred with constitutional specialists. When thinking about how being a royal would affect children in the long run, he spoke with psychologists. In an effort to comprehend Harry's decisions and the freedom, however tangled, that those choices had granted, he sought out a private meeting with his brother in an impartial setting. As William talked about the burden he felt, the continual monitoring, and the difficulty of genuine connection when every word could be in the news the next day, Harry listened objectively. Your decision to leave made you seem weak to me. William came clean. Now I see that you were courageous. My anger was not at you for shirking your responsibilities, but rather for seizing the independence I lacked the guts to pursue. There was still a gap in the brothers' rapprochement. There were still too many open wounds, but it did signal a change. Without advising or trying to sway William's choice, Harry remained silent. He only stated, no matter what you decide, people will criticize you. Pick what makes you sleep at night. Pick what makes you feel safe enough to look your kids in the face. This statement was made in an effort to include Catherine in the conversations. They had a 7-hour summit with King Carlos and Queen Camilla. Queen Camilla, who had been exiled and then accepted, talked with shocking vehemence on the poisonousness of a life lived as a royal without being genuine. Charles was almost destroyed by this institution, she stated frankly. It wasn't at a dramatic moment, but on a peaceful evening at Adelaide Cottage, when the choice crystallized. After all, it had already destroyed Diana and driven Harry away. Once the kids were asleep and the house was at peace, William and Catherine settled down to a quiet night together. He warned Catherine, there's no guarantee we'll be allowed back. The institution does not forgive easily. She put her hand in his, and he continued to speak. We risk dying if we don't take this action. No one at the institution has to show mercy on us. Forgiveness of ourselves is essential. We measured and weighed every word as it was penned over the course of 3 days. Palace attorneys reviewed it for any constitutional problems. Though press secretaries deliberated about the best time and message to go out that October morning, the words that reached the world were William's own, devoid of diplomatic ostentation and flair. Because he cared for his family, and hence himself, he was taking an eternal step back. Villains wreaking havoc. Buckingham Palace became a crisis management command center in the hours after the announcement. After decades of service to the crown, senior advisors were left with no pattern to follow. Private secretaries contacted constitutional experts in a panic. There was an unprecedented avalanche of requests from the media, and press officers were bracing themselves to deal with them. Saying the right things and staying silent strategically would not have solved this scandal. The future monarch was avoiding his fate in this image. That fact remained unaffected by any amount of denial. Within half an hour of the statement's publication, the highest-ranking official in the royal family, Lord Chamberlain Andrew Parker, called an urgent meeting to the Bow Room. In attendance were individuals from the Lord Chamberlain's office, the private secretary to the king, the former private secretary to the Prince of Wales, as well as numerous constitutional advisors whose knowledge had never been put to the test like this. There was an air of tension, with voices controlled with care, but an obvious undercurrent of fear in every conversation. One of the press secretaries argued that we must take charge of the story before it takes over, and they began formulating arguments that would cast William's choice as a matter of temporary medical leave or stress-related fatigue. However, the very pragmatic Sir Clive Alderton slashed through the spin with his trademark candor. Alderton served as private secretary to King Charles. "Gentlemen, ladies," he commanded, "hush the audience. There is no need to worry about public relations at this time. A familial disaster has engulfed us, and with it, a constitutional catastrophe." Without uttering a single word, the future monarch has essentially abdicated. That reality will remain unchanged regardless of how wording is adjusted. He waited for the impact of his remarks to sink in before continuing. "Our job is not to tell deceitful stories. Our mission is to find out if this organization can adjust to the new normal or if it will drown in its own attempts to pretend everything is fine." There was a reckoning in Parliament as the palace squatted. 30 minutes prior to the public speech, the Prime Minister was notified of William's decision through a courtesy call from the King, which conveyed both information and an implied threat. Government sanction had no bearing on this. Immediate consultation was held with Westminster's constitutional experts. Their thoughts were sought after on matters ranging from the consequences of succession to issues related to national stability. The head of the opposition party requested a special meeting to address the potential constitutional consequences. From those on the political left to those on the right, lawmakers voiced opinions ranging from sympathy for William's right to privacy to fury at what they perceived as a failure in duty. However, behind the scenes of public pronouncements and legislative drama, a more complex discourse was taking place in private offices and across encrypted phone lines. Members of Parliament who had worked with William for many years on different projects were worried about him. According to their account, the man had been acting more and more tense over the past few months, and he had taken a careful but obviously exhausted attitude to his work. Off the record, a cabinet minister mentioned that William had recently questioned mental health services in a direct manner during a briefing. Inquiries that, looking back, appeared to be more about the individual's experience than the policy in hand. He wanted to know if I could help him, the minister told a colleague, if the institution would let it, and if admitting to having problems would be perceived as a sign of weakness instead of strength. Responding in accordance with party policy, I assured them that help was available and emphasized the importance of mental health. But now I see that he wasn't acting like a prince who wanted to know about policy when he asked. As a guy engulfed in a role he had no say in creating, he posed the question. Even outside of Britain, the Commonwealth nations watched William's departure with mixed emotions, concern, pity, and calculation. The future of the institution of the British monarchy was instantly called into doubt in other kingdoms where he or she serves as head of state. Is it possible for constitutional monarchies may survive in the modern day if the heir finds the role intolerable? The Australian Governor-General issued a carefully written statement expressing her sympathies with William's plight, but also acknowledging that it would unavoidably heighten Republican feeling in her nation. "We Australians have argued about our constitutional system for a long time." According to her, this new information will definitely intensify such conversations. A more difficult reality was concealed by the diplomatic language. Those who claimed the monarchy had become a dinosaur that couldn't handle the present world had more evidence with William's departure. The response in Canada was more subdued. In a brief remark, the Prime Minister conveyed his faith in the institution's resiliency while respecting William's privacy. Recognizing that the monarchy's grip on former colonies had always been weak, sustained more by inaction than enthusiasm, Canadian authorities began quietly revising backup plans for constitutional reform. Commonwealth states that are smaller and more vulnerable, especially those in the Caribbean that are still coping with the effects of colonialism, saw in William's ruling an opportunity for reform. Even those born into the royal family know the burden of power might be too much to bear. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, who had previously stated his intention to seek Republican status, took this opportunity to make a gentle observation. Maybe we should all take stock of whether this institution really helps us or if we have been its servants for far too long. Within a few hours, the usual level of media attention outside Kensington Palace had grown into an oppressive mob. The streets were lined with satellite trucks. Foreign news reporters flocked to the scene. In an effort to decipher the meaning of the formal statement, every major news outlet dispatched its top royal reporters. From well-intentioned hypotheses on mental health and familial influences to completely reckless claims regarding hidden diseases, extramarital affairs, and palace plots, speculation was abundant. Extra editions with more sensational headlines were issued by the British tabloids, which are notoriously unrestrained. One day, will he be king? Outraged one. The vanishing prince made a different proclamation. American media outlets that were less concerned with royal protocol examined William's past in great detail, revisiting old anecdotes and conducting interviews with long-lost friends and acquaintances, all while portraying the situation as a tragic comedy. Opinion wars sprang out on social media. Generation Y was mostly in favor of William's decision, seeing it as a positive break from poisonous duty and a commendable focus on family and mental health. The elderly were divided. Some felt sorry for him because of the hardships he endured, while others were disappointed because he betrayed their trust in public service. Almost exactly half of the population had an opinion after the first 48 hours of chaos, according to polls. Williams's decision was understood by 51% of people, but 49% saw it as a complete lack of accountability on his part. However, a deeper discourse started to surface amidst the din. Public life's impact on people's mental health was brought up by psychologists and mental health advocates throughout the event. Veterans of the royal family coverage started writing more nuanced essays about the enormous pressures that those born into the family face. Some, who had made a living by railing against the royals, finally stopped to admit that maybe the system, and not the people shackled by it, needed the most severe criticism. William was the one who had to deal with the public fallout of the choice, but within palace walls, Catherine had an equally tough time. Many people wondered what part she played in William's decision, even though she had purposefully opted not to appear in the formal statement in order to shield herself from the initial media barrage. Some media sites portrayed her as the one who planned his departure, a strong, independent woman who would never put her family's needs below her work. Some said she was crushed by his decision, and now she was stuck in a relationship she didn't want. Both accounts were false. A discreet lunch at Clarence House, away from prying eyes, was held by Catherine and Queen Camilla 3 days following the news. Due to generational and environmental differences, the two women's relationship had always been friendly, but somewhat cold. Camilla understood Catherine's predicament better than anybody else since she, too, was the woman accused of upsetting royal decorum. They will portray you as either the hero or the victim, Camilla warned while sipping tea. They prefer to understand that you are just a woman attempting to shield your family from unfathomable dangers rather than that either of those things is true, she said as she paused to stir her tea with meticulous care. I believe the worst was past when Charles and I tied the knot. Being a part of the institution, however, is far more challenging than being outside of it. You can make out every piece of machinery, every calculation, and every instance of people being reduced to nothing more than symbols and functions. Her expression remained calm as she listened, but the tension from the past several weeks was palpable in her eyes. Were you ever sorry you did it? Quietly, she inquired. Getting hitched to this? The question was given great consideration by Camilla. It hurt, and for that I am sorry. Considering how much time and money it took, I am disappointed. Love may have been a crown of thorns, but I will never regret choosing it. Catherine was the object of her intense gaze. William has made his family decision. He might be rescuing the monarchy from its own demise if he does this. Whether it makes him foolish or wise will be determined by history. The kids in the middle. The world seemed to have spun on its axis as 3 kids attempted to make sense of it all, while grown-ups dealt with constitutional problems and media storms. Even though he was still too young to completely understand the significance of what had happened, 12-year-old Prince George could tell that something major had happened. Even when grown-ups attempted to protect her, 9-year-old Princess Charlotte could sense the tension because of her exceptional emotional intelligence. Even though he was 7 years old and mostly oblivious to the details, Prince Louis could feel the shift in their home's vibe. For William and Catherine, the choice to inform the kids had been excruciating. After talking to child psychologists and considering other methods, they settled on using age-appropriate language while yet being honest. On a gloomy afternoon, they greeted their 3 children in the living room of Adelaide Cottage. This is an English autumn day like no other, when even the light is hazy. With a calm yet gentle voice, William started to explain that we needed to discuss some adjustments with you. Severe and perceptive, George straightened in his chair as he prepared to hear news he felt would be challenging. As she had done since Lizzie's birth, Charlotte instinctively grasped for her younger brother's hand in a protective gesture. For the time being, Papa will step away from some of his regal duties. Our family is going to make an effort to spend more time together. A complicated emotional reaction was set off for George by the news. He had spent his entire conscious life being gently prepped for a future of service, being second in line to the throne. From the time he was a little boy, He had been instilled with the values of responsibility, sacrifice, and the importance of serving one's nation over one's own desires. Now George seemed to be contradicted by his father, the one who had taught him these teachings. George asked with a low voice, "But what about being king?" William glanced at his eldest son George and saw a mirror image of his own bewilderment from infancy in his eyes as he stated, "You always said that was the most important thing." The conventional wisdom held that love and duty were diametrically opposed, rather than complementary, principles. According to William, I was mistaken. Something changed in that instant when the parents were honest. Being a father is more significant than being a king. What matters more is that you are a decent husband to your mother. It is more necessary to prioritize self-care so that we may adequately attend to the needs of others. In the days that followed, William and George strolled the Windsor grounds for hours, during which time they discussed topics such as responsibility and agency, as well as the distinction between slavery and service. It was not desertion, he said. Rather, it was an effort to recalibrate, to discover a long-term equilibrium between civic duty and individual humanity. He recounted Diana's struggles, including her attempts to provide William and Harry with an ordinary upbringing and her dissatisfaction with her royal position, which she blamed on herself. "Granny Diana wanted you to be free," George stated one afternoon after listening to his father's stories. Understatement. "She wanted all of us to be free," William corrected softly. "She understood that being born royal shouldn't mean surrendering everything that makes us human. She fought for that understanding, and it cost her dearly. I'm trying to finish what she started in my own way." George processed this silently, his young mind grappling with concepts that even adults struggled to reconcile. Finally, he asked the question that revealed his deepest fear. "Does this mean I won't have to be king?" The hope in his voice nearly broke William's composure. "I don't know," William answered honestly. "The line of succession doesn't change just because I'm taking time away. But maybe by the time you're grown, we'll have figured out a better way. A way that doesn't require you to stop being George in order to become king." William and Catherine made a deliberate decision not to completely shield their children from the public conversation about their father's withdrawal. They monitored what the children saw and heard, of course, but they also used age-appropriate language to explain that some people were upset, some were supportive, and many were simply confused. This honesty, they hoped, would prepare their children for the reality that royal life meant public opinion, often harsh and always divided. "People will always have thoughts about what we do," William explained during a family meeting. "That's part of being public figures, but we can't let other people's opinions make our decisions for us. We have to do what we believe is right for our family, and then trust that history will judge us fairly." It was a lesson in integrity over image, in authenticity over approval. Whether it would serve the children well in the long term remained to be seen. But in that moment, it felt like the most honest parenting William and Catherine had ever offered. They were not raising future monarchs according to centuries of protocol. They were raising human beings who happened to be born into extraordinary circumstances and trying to give those human beings the tools to navigate those circumstances without losing themselves in the process. The institution's reckoning. As days turned into weeks following William's withdrawal, the British monarchy faced questions it had successfully avoided for generations. The institution's survival had always depended on a careful balance between tradition and adaptation, between maintaining mystique and demonstrating relevance. William's decision disrupted that balance, forcing palace officials, politicians, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about the sustainability of hereditary monarchy in the 21st century. Behind closed doors, senior royals engaged in conversations that would have been unthinkable even a decade earlier. King Charles convened what he termed a family council, a meeting that included not just working royals, but also advisors, constitutional experts, and surprisingly representatives from mental health organizations. The agenda was simple yet profound. How does the monarchy adapt without abandoning its fundamental nature? Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, spoke with characteristic bluntness. "We have spent centuries asking individuals to sacrifice themselves for the institution. Perhaps it is time the institution sacrificed some of its rigidity for the individuals." Her words carried weight, coming from someone who had devoted her entire life to royal duty without complaint or drama, who had seen her mother navigate impossible challenges, who had watched her family struggle with the gap between public image and private reality. Prince Edward, the youngest of Charles's siblings, offered a different perspective, one shaped by his own decision to pursue a career outside traditional royal duties before eventually returning to the fold. "I stepped away once," he reminded the room. "It was portrayed as a failure at the time. However, I was able to return on more reasonable conditions after the distance given me perspective. Perhaps William needs the same space." royal advisors found themselves in an unprecedented position. Their job had always been to protect the institution, to manage crisis, to ensure the monarchy's continued relevance and stability. But how could they advise on a situation where the heir himself had determined that the institution's demands were incompatible with his well-being? How could they argue for duty when that argument had demonstrably driven one of the most prepared, dedicated heirs in history to a breaking point? Sir Clive Alderton, speaking in the family council, outlined the stark reality. Every strategy we have employed for decades assumes that royals will ultimately choose duty over personal happiness. William has shattered that assumption. We can condemn him, pressure him to return, and attempt to frame this as temporary mental health leave. But if we do, we risk confirming the very criticism that threatens us, that the monarchy is an archaic institution that consumes its people in service of an outdated ideal, he continued, his voice measured but firm. Alternatively, we can treat this as an opportunity. We can acknowledge that royal service, like any form of public service, must be sustainable. We can demonstrate that even an ancient institution can prioritize human well-being. We can show that duty need not mean destruction. The debate that followed was intense. Traditionalists argued that conceding to William's withdrawal would set a precedent that would erode royal commitment across generations. Reformers countered that refusing to adapt would make the monarchy increasingly irrelevant, particularly to younger generations who valued mental health and work-life balance over blind obedience to tradition. An unexpected voice of support came from the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury, spiritual leader of the Church, of which the monarch serves as supreme governor, issued a statement that surprised many observers. Rather than defending institutional duty, he spoke of the sacred importance of family, of the Christian mandate to care for oneself in order to serve others, of the biblical examples of leaders who retreated for periods of reflection and renewal. Our Lord himself withdrew from public ministry when the demands became overwhelming. The Archbishop noted in a sermon delivered at Westminster Abbey. He sought solitude, prayer, and restoration. If Christ recognized the necessity of stepping back, can we condemn a prince for doing likewise? It was a theological justification that gave cover to William's decision, reframing his withdrawal not as dereliction, but as spiritual wisdom. The Archbishop's statement sparked discussion within religious communities about the relationship between duty and self-care, between service and sacrifice. Progressive clergy embraced the message, using it to advocate for healthier approaches to ministry and leadership. Conservative factions worried it provided justification for abandoning difficult responsibilities. But the conversation itself represented a shift, an acknowledgement that even institutions claiming divine sanction must reckon with human limitations. Initial polling had shown the British public divided on William's decision. But as weeks passed and more details emerged through carefully managed media appearances and background briefings, public sentiment began to shift. When it became clear that William's withdrawal was driven primarily by concern for his children and his marriage, sympathy increased significantly. When psychologists and mental health experts publicly discussed the unique pressures of royal life, understanding grew. A particularly influential moment came when several high-profile figures shared their own experiences with burnout and the difficult decision to step back from successful careers for family reasons. A tech executive who had left a Fortune 500 company to address personal health issues wrote an editorial comparing her experience to William's, noting that if we applaud corporate leaders for recognizing their limits, why do we condemn a prince for the same wisdom? Younger demographics especially resonated with William's choice. Surveys of 18 to 30-year-olds showed overwhelming support, with many citing it as evidence that even the most traditional institutions could evolve. "My generation doesn't believe you should have to destroy yourself for a job," one 24-year-old told a pollster. "It doesn't matter if that job is retail or royalty. Everyone deserves the right to prioritize their mental health and family." Older generations remained more skeptical. But even among that demographic, support grew as the narrative shifted from abandonment of duty to prioritization of family. British culture, for all its complications, retained a deep respect for parenthood, for the sacrifices parents make for their children. When the story was framed as a father choosing his children over his career, even traditionalists found it harder to condemn. As November approached, with William having been withdrawn from public life for several weeks, pressure mounted for the royal family to provide clarity about the future. Would William return? If so, when and under what conditions? If not, what did that mean for the line of succession? For George's future? For the institution itself? King Charles addressed these questions in a televised statement, his first substantive comments since the initial announcement. Speaking from Windsor Castle, he stood before the camera with the gravitas that kingship demanded, but also with a father's compassion that humanized the moment. "My son has made a decision that reflects both courage and wisdom," Charles began. "He has recognized that he can best serve his family and ultimately his future role by taking time to address the well-being of those he loves and his own mental and emotional health. I wholeheartedly endorse this choice as his father. It poses a threat to long-held beliefs, and I, as king, am aware of it. However, traditions that bring to the downfall of those who adhere to them are not worth maintaining in their original form." He went on to detail a fresh structure that had been worked out in tandem with constitutional scholars and legislative heavyweights. William would still be considered next in line, but other serving royals would take on more responsibilities while he was away. He is under no obligation to return by a certain date. In its place, the royal family would keep the public apprised of William's whereabouts and readiness to resume royal duties at regular intervals. "We are venturing into uncharted territory," Charles said. "But the monarchy has survived by adapting, by recognizing when change is necessary, by putting people before protocol when the stakes demand it. This is such a moment. My son's well-being, my grandchildren's futures, and the health of this institution all depend on our ability to choose humanity over hollow tradition." The speech was remarkable for its honesty, for Charles's willingness to validate his son's decision, even while acknowledging the complications it created. Reaction was mixed predictably, but it succeeded in shifting the narrative from crisis to evolution, from scandal to reform, the beginning of something new. 2 months after the initial announcement, William and Catherine granted their first interview since the withdrawal. It was carefully orchestrated, conducted by a respected journalist known for fairness rather than sensationalism. Filmed not at a palace, but at Adelaide Cottage in their private space. The setting itself was a statement. This was not a prince submitting to institutional protocol, but a man and woman speaking on their own terms. They appeared relaxed, though not entirely at ease. William wore a simple sweater and jeans, deliberately casual. Catherine sat beside him, close enough to occasionally touch his hand, a small gesture of solidarity. When asked the inevitable question about why they had made this decision, William did not offer platitudes or diplomatic evasion. "I was disappearing," he said simply. "Not dying, not in any dramatic sense, but slowly fading beneath the weight of what everyone expected me to be. As a husband, I was falling short. I could sense that my role as a father was starting to crumble. Then it hit me. By the time I became king, I would have nothing genuine to offer if I kept going in that direction." Catherine talked about their marriage with an honesty that is unusual for royal couples. "On occasion, I would glance at William and fail to recognize the husband I had wed. I realized I could do something about it after the prince had eaten the person. I could keep quiet, put up a brave front, and let our marriage suffer as a result of my need to be flawless. Or I could be brave, admit what was wrong, and try to mend our relationship." Rather than an ultimatum, she framed the letter she had penned, the one that had prompted William's decision, as an effort at being completely forthright. She made it clear that she was not requesting that he decide between her and the crown. He had to decide if he wanted to be a symbol or an actual person, and that was my question to him. A sign could never win my heart. All I could ever adore was a man. These revelations were shockingly personal, coming from a couple who had been so private for so long in the public eye. However, being forthright was a conscious decision. They aimed to show that taking a step back was not a complete collapse, but rather a deliberate realignment, that their marriage had not ended but rather been given room to recover. William described the shifts that had occurred in their routine. Each night, they shared supper, assisted with assignments. As a family, they watched movies without William checking his phone for messages from the palace. Most households didn't give any thought to these little luxuries. Nevertheless, they stood for the reclaimed genuineness that had been progressively eroded by royal life. William admitted that he was aware that some people saw this as the obligation of shirking. "However, my family, my wife and children, are my primary obligation. What kind of success is it if I disappoint them while becoming a prince?" The children bore the brunt of William's estrangement. Unnamed insiders close to the palace said that George, in particular, but all 3 siblings, had undergone a tremendous change. After becoming distant and overly serious for his age, the young prince had rediscovered his carefree spirit. His laughter continued to grow. He was less self-conscious while he played. The burden of his future, if not entirely removed, had been momentarily alleviated. The event that Catherine recounted took place only days prior to the interview. A classmate had ridiculed George about his father's resignation, so George came to her after school upset. He was able to vent his anger and bewilderment to Catherine, who sat with him. After that, she posed a question to him. "How does your affection for your father compare to how it was before?" Finally, because he's here, George answered more questions after giving them careful consideration. According to Catherine, that one sentence perfectly captured their decision. A present-day father is more valuable to a child than an aloof future ruler. Raising George to be a healthy, happy human being was sacrificed in our pursuit of grooming him to be a ruler. These days, we just can't make that sacrifice. Not only were Charlotte and Louis relieved of future expectations, but the modifications had also been beneficial to them. Catherine painted a picture of a less formal home, where happiness was more of an afterthought, and spending time with loved ones was not seen as a chore wedge between royal engagements, but as the bedrock upon which their life rested. As a result of William's departure, the palace had to reevaluate all of the royal traditions and expectations. In order to lay a better groundwork for the royal family's long-term viability, a working committee was formed. Among the issues being discussed were the following: a complete change in the definition of service, clearly defined restrictions on working hours, required mental health support, regular family time free from royal obligations, and more. Because of her long history of faithful devotion, Princess Anne was able to command respect and credibility as the group's chair. Her usual pragmatic attitude guided her approach to the task. The old model assumed unlimited personal resources. She noted in an internal memo that was later obtained by the public. We expected undivided attention without realizing that this would drive people to their breaking point. We need to rethink the royal service so that it is more viable and less exploitative, as the William issue has shown. Some of the suggested changes included the introduction of royal counseling services, the demarcation of public and private spheres, and the creation of a new protocol to enable the discreet handling of personal matters and family emergencies above ceremonial responsibilities, free from scandal or criticism. These alterations, if carried out, would signify the most substantial shift in royal expectations in several decades. Unfortunately, not all palace residents were in favor of these changes. Opponents of the reforms said they would undermine the monarchy's foundational principles, instill a sense of entitlement in the next generation of royals, and eliminate the sense of duty that had helped it weather centuries of turmoil. It was not a sign of weakness, but of survival, the reformers said, as the organization could not continue to undermine its members' well-being on a regular basis. At the end of the interview, the question that everyone was hoping William and Catherine would answer was finally posed. Will William be able to resume his role as king? On what date, if any? William responded with restraint. Uncertain, he confessed. It is the truth, yet it may annoy those who need assurance. While we are here, Catherine and I are trying to figure out how to be a sustainable royal family for ourselves and our children. Yes, we will return if we can discover a way to serve the institution without sacrificing who we are as individuals and a family. If this is not possible, we will need to accept the situation as it is and go on. He took a moment to collect himself before continuing. What I do know is that I will not return to the way things were. That model was destroying me and threatening my family. If the institution can only accept total sacrifice, then it's the institution that needs to change, not me. The camera caught Catherine's supportive hand squeeze as she offered him a reassuring squeeze. What had been absent from royal life for far too long became apparent to viewers in that one moment. Genuine collaboration, regard for one another, and putting people above procedures. Rather than concluding with clear-cut answers, the interview concluded by recognizing the presence of doubt. Making choices in the absence of a guide or example, William and Catherine were venturing into uncharted terrain. It was their shared goal to discover a way to serve without destroying themselves, to demonstrate that even long-standing institutions could adapt if they prioritized survival over intransigence, and whether they succeeded or failed, it would have been an honor for them both. Instead of marking the finish, Prince William's withdrawal heralds the beginning, the first step in discussing the survival or demise of long-standing institutions. Although it goes against centuries of royal tradition, his decision to put family first gives optimism that even the most inflexible systems can change. Can the monarchy, as Britain waits, manage to respect its history while still recognizing the humanity of its people? Post your opinions down here. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and press the bell icon. Thanks for watching.